A dragonfly with a wingspan bigger than a hawk's wing. A millipede 2.5 meters long, longer than a person. A scorpion that could kill with a single strike. This isn't a scene from a science fiction movie. This is Earth. 300 million years ago, long before the dinosaurs, long before the first mammals, the planet had rulers, and they were insects. The tiniest creatures alive today were once the biggest predators on land, and the first in history to conquer the sky. 4 questions. First, why were insects so gigantic, and why will that never happen again? Second, how did insects even crawl out of the water and become the first to conquer dry land, ahead of every other animal? Third, who were the biggest and scariest monsters of this era? And fourth, why did this era end, and what's left of it today? Let's start at the very beginning, the moment life first dared to leave the water. 430 million years ago, land was dead, bare rock, no plants, no animals. The water teemed with life, but the earth was empty. And the first ones who dared to change that weren't fish, weren't amphibians. The first animals to walk on land were arthropods, the ancestors of modern spiders, scorpions, millipedes. This happened toward the end of the Silurian period, long before the first fish even attempted to crawl onto shore. Why them? The answer is in their body structure. An exoskeleton, armor made of chitin, protected them from drying out. That same shell that held its shape in water became, on land, a shield against the biggest enemy any creature faces when it crawls onto a beach. The sun and the air, both pulling moisture straight out of the body. But the armor only solved one problem. There was another one left, and it was literally lethal. The breathing systems of these first land pioneers were built for water. The switch to breathing air didn't happen instantly, and it didn't happen without losses. Generation after generation made the attempt, and some of them failed. These were, quite literally, the first creatures in the history of the planet trying to breathe air. Something that sounds simple to us was, for them, a real risk of suffocating inside their own bodies. The ones who survived that transition opened the door to a world with no competitors, and others followed. Plants had blazed the trail even earlier. They began colonizing land around 470 million years ago. By the middle of the Devonian period, dry land was already covered in greenery that resembled modern forests in structure, even if completely different in composition. Mosses, fern-like plants, the first vascular plants with roots pushing down into rock. And right behind the plants came the first animals. First, mites and primitive arachnids feeding on decaying organic matter. Then, millipedes. And around 410 million years ago, at the start of the Devonian period, the first true insects crawled onto land. The earliest members of this group had no wings. They were small, easy to overlook, something close to modern silverfish, tiny insects that still live in damp, dark places today. The oldest fossil of such an insect ever found comes from Quebec, nearly 400 million years old. But the real revolution came later, and it changed more than just insects. It rewrote the rules of the game for every living thing on the planet. Around 350 million years ago, insects invented flight. Stop for a second and take in the scale of that moment. Before this, no creature on Earth had ever flown. Not once, in the entire history of life on the planet. Insects were the first to lift themselves into the air using nothing but the power of their own muscles, a full 90 million years before a single vertebrate would manage the same thing. To understand what 90 million years actually means, compare it to something you already know. From the extinction of the dinosaurs to today is 66 million years. 90 million is more than that entire stretch times 1.5. Insects owned the sky completely, on their own, for longer than the entire age of mammals, the very age we're living in right now. A whole era of sky that belonged exclusively to insects. And it was during this exact stretch of time that something happened that turned them into giants. How wings actually evolved is still one of the biggest unsolved puzzles in evolutionary biology. Transitional fossils are almost non-existent. Wingless insects, we have those. Insects with fully formed functional wings, we have those too. But the in-between stage is almost completely missing from the fossil record. And that's not just a gap in the science, it's a lost chapter from one of the most important stories in the history of life. Millions of years of transitional forms experimenting with little flaps, gliding, the first attempts at powered flight, and not a single witness left behind in stone. What we have is only the before and the after. The actual moment of transformation is hidden from us forever. There are two main theories. The first, wings evolved from gill-like structures on aquatic larvae, similar to the ones modern mayfly nymphs still have today. The second, and the more popular one among scientists, wings grew out of small side extensions on the thorax. At first, tiny flaps that helped insects glide when they fell off plants. Gradually, those flaps grew bigger, more mobile, and eventually turned into true wings capable of powered, controlled flight. If that sounds familiar, it's because humanity walked the exact same path, much, much later. The Wright brothers spent years experimenting with small gliders that gradually evolved into real wings capable of holding an aircraft in the air. Insects went through that same process of trial, error, and gradual refinement 300 million years before Kitty Hawk. Whichever theory turns out to be correct, the result changed everything. Flying insects suddenly had access to a space with no competitors, no predators, a way to escape danger on the ground simply by lifting off. A way to find food and mates quickly across enormous distances. And at this exact same moment, something else happened. Something that turned an ordinary evolutionary breakthrough into an entire age of giants. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to rise, sharply. The dense carboniferous forests, the very forests that would eventually become the coal we mine today, were producing oxygen on a scale never seen before. Atmospheric oxygen climbed to levels that would never be matched again in the planet's entire later history. And the insect respiratory system, a network of tracheal tubes delivering oxygen directly to tissue without any help from blood, had one particular quirk. The more oxygen in the air, the bigger a body that system could support. The door to a world of giants had just swung open. Picture yourself standing in a carboniferous forest. Silence. And then, a shadow passes overhead. Wingspan over 70 centimeters, about the size of a seagull. Meganeuropsis, the largest flying insect that ever existed on Earth. A dragonfly-like creature 43 centimeters long, with a wingspan reaching 72 centimeters. For comparison, the largest dragonfly alive today has a wingspan of just 12.5 centimeters. Meganeuropsis was 5.5 times bigger. People often call this insect and its relatives giant dragonflies. That's not quite accurate. They belong to a group called Meganeuroptera, a separate extinct order only distantly related to modern dragonflies. Because of that evolutionary distance and the physical differences from today's dragonflies and damselflies, scientists use the term Griffin fly instead. Griffin flies were predators, feeding mostly on other insects. Picture a flying hunter the size of a seagull patrolling a forest 30 meters tall. Their legs carried large spines used to seize prey. But there's a detail that makes this insect even more fascinating. Because of its body size and wing structure, griffin flies couldn't pull off the same sharp, agile maneuvers modern dragonflies can. They likely spent a lot of time sitting still just to keep enough oxygen flowing properly through their tissue. And in that detail lies the hidden weakness of the biggest predator the sky had ever seen. The largest flying insect in the history of the planet, for all its size and predatory power, was completely dependent on oxygen levels in the air, something entirely outside its control. An enormous creature tied to the chemistry of the atmosphere of its time. And when that chemistry began to shift, the giant couldn't adapt fast enough. Massive, predatory, and at the same time dependent on a world that could change at any moment. A giant gliding slowly between the trees, waiting and striking. Now let's come back down to the ground, because something crawled down there that still holds the record. Before we get into how harmless it actually was, picture the moment of actually running into one. The rustle of dry leaves under the weight of a creature 2 meters long, a shadow moving just slightly too slowly for something that size, and finally, the sight itself. Dozens of legs rippling in a wave along an armored body, coming straight at you down a forest trail. Your modern human brain doesn't have time to process "it's a herbivore" faster than the raw instinctive fear of that shape and that scale. And now, the facts. Because this creature turns out to be nothing like the monster it appears to be. Arthropleura, a giant millipede, up to 240 centimeters long, the largest land arthropod known to have ever existed, longer than a fully grown adult. Reconstructions of an adult specimen put the total body length at 2 meters, with segments reaching 45 centimeters wide at the broadest point. Picture that. A creature as wide as your arm from shoulder to fingertip, crawling across the forest floor on dozens of legs at once. Its body was made up of roughly 30 segments, each with a pair of legs on either side, around 60 legs in total. Every segment's back was covered in armor plating that flared out at the sides, like a millipede wearing its own suit of armor. And that size left tracks that scientists still find today. The fossilized trackways left by Arthropleura are so large and so clear they could almost be mistaken for machinery, if not for the age of the rock. The width of the trackway exceeds ½ a meter. Picture a paleontologist stumbling onto one of these for the first time in the rock, pausing for a second, wondering what could have left a print this massive, this rhythmic in stone, 300 million years old. A track as wide as your forearm, and the creature that left it turns out to be nothing like the monster it appears to be. Unlike predatory giants such as Meganeuropsis, Arthropleura was a detritivore, or herbivore. Fossilized trackways show it moving through dense vegetation, feeding on plant matter. The largest land invertebrate in history wasn't a killing machine. It was a peaceful giant. Its enormous size most likely served as protection from predators and let it efficiently break down massive quantities of plant material in the swampy forests it called home. But picture what you'd feel running into a 2-meter millipede coming toward you on a forest path. Even a peaceful one, even a herbivore. And finally, the land's true hunter. The one that actually hunted. And even though it was smaller than the previous 2 giants, it was, in fact, the most dangerous of all 3. Pulmonoscorpius, the largest land scorpion that ever existed. Length from head to the tip of its stinger, 70 centimeters, roughly the size of a house cat, 3 times bigger than the largest land scorpion alive today. Pulmonoscorpius was one of the apex predators of early Carboniferous Scotland. Picture a creature the size of a cat, but armored in chitin, armed with claws and carrying a stinger loaded with venom. Hiding in dense vegetation, waiting for prey. Its name translates to lung scorpion. It appeared during the Carboniferous period 350 to 330 million years ago and was roughly the size of a small dog. Unlike most modern scorpions, which are largely nocturnal and hide from the heat, this giant lived in humid, swampy forests where moisture and shade were everywhere. Its prey included insects, small amphibians, and possibly even other scorpions. In a world with no large vertebrate predators, Pulmonoscorpius was one of the rulers of the land. Less famous, less visually striking. But this hunter could kill faster than anything else in that forest. Imagine you could step into a Carboniferous forest for just 1 minute. Trees 30 to 40 meters tall, but these aren't oaks or pines. These are giant lycophytes and horsetails, relatives of small modern plants that today grow to, at most, a few dozen centimeters. The air is thick and humid. Oxygen concentration is far higher than it is today. In the air, the shadows of giant Griffin flies gliding silently between the trunks. On the ground, the slow movement of a millipede the size of a human carving its path through the undergrowth. In the shadow of the roots, a scorpion the size of a cat lying in wait. No birds, no large mammals, no predatory reptiles to compete with. This world belonged entirely to arthropods. An era when the smallest creatures of today were once the biggest, most powerful predators on the planet. But why did they become giants in the first place? And where did it all go? Time to answer the first question we asked at the very beginning. Why were Carboniferous insects so gigantic, and why has that never happened again? The most famous theory: oxygen. The rise of vast lowland swamp forests pushed atmospheric oxygen levels up to around 30%, nearly 50% higher than today. A thick, humid climate fueled the growth of enormous swamp forests. Through photosynthesis, these plants pumped massive amounts of oxygen into the atmosphere while pulling in carbon dioxide. But why did insects specifically become giants and not every living thing across the board? The answer lies in how insects breathe. Unlike humans or other vertebrates, insects don't have lungs with blood carrying oxygen around. Instead, they have a network of microscopic tubes, tracheae, that deliver oxygen directly to every cell in the body. This system runs on simple diffusion. Oxygen moves through the tubes with no pump pushing it along. The problem with a system like that is diffusion is limited by distance. The bigger the body, the longer the path oxygen has to travel from the surface to the center. Under normal conditions, that caps how large an insect can get. But when there's more oxygen in the air, diffusion becomes effective over a longer distance. The widespread gigantism seen in late Paleozoic insects and other arthropods lines up with increased oxygen flow within diffusion-limited tracheal systems, and with that, a loosening of the limits on maximum insect body size. More oxygen in the air meant a bigger maximum body size that this breathing system could support. There's a second factor tied to flight. Since overall atmospheric pressure rises along with oxygen's partial pressure, a denser atmosphere at the same time boosted the aerodynamic lift early flying insects could generate. Thicker air made it easier for a heavy body to fly. That may have been what let Griffin flies with their enormous wings get off the ground in the first place. It seemed like the perfect explanation. Simple, elegant, but there's a problem. The paleontological evidence linking insect size to atmospheric oxygen levels is, at best, weakly correlated. Researchers compiled a massive dataset. Using a collection of over 10,500 fossilized insect wing lengths, scientists showed that size only tracked atmospheric oxygen concentration for the first 150 million years of insect evolution. Stop for a second and think about what's behind that number. 10,500. Every single one of those fossilized wings is a separate piece of evidence from a specific moment in the planet's deep past. Behind that figure are decades of fieldwork, thousands of expeditions, millions of hours spent cataloging specimens in museum collections around the world. All of it just to gather enough evidence to test the theory that seemed obvious. Decades of work just to prove that the simple answer wasn't enough. And that's exactly how real science works. Beyond that point, the pattern falls apart. And here's the most interesting piece of evidence against the simple oxygen theory. The existence of giant griffin flies in the late Permian period, after oxygen levels had already started dropping, contradicts the oxygen-driven gigantism theory. If oxygen were the only cause, why did giants keep existing even as oxygen levels fell? In 2023, a team of scientists led by Ned Snellin at the University of Pretoria ran experiments on modern insects raised in oxygen-enriched conditions. The results seriously called into question the old idea that oxygen levels limited and continue to limit insect body size. If it's not oxygen, then what? Snellin believes the simplest explanation is that predators got bigger too. When giant insects filled the skies, there were no birds and no bats. A large insect was safe simply because nothing could catch it in the air. And that leads us straight to the answer to our last question. Why did this age of giants come to an end? The simplest answer is climate. By the end of the Carboniferous and through the Permian, the vast swamp forests began retreating. The climate grew drier. The wetlands where insects laid their larvae started disappearing. Most giant insects went extinct by the end of the Carboniferous as Earth grew drier and the swamps they depended on vanished. But there's a second reason, and it's far more interesting. Picture this moment concretely. Somewhere in a sky that had belonged to insects for millions of years, a shadow appeared that didn't belong there. 90 million years of dominance. Generation after generation of Griffin flies were born, lived, and died of old age, never once knowing what it meant to be prey in the air. And then, in the skies of the Triassic, the silhouette of a pterosaur appeared for the first time. A shape no insect had ever seen before, a shape no instinct was prepared for. It moved the way they did, but it was hunting them.
And from that point on, the sky was never quite as safe again. Research offered weak support for the influence of pterosaurs, flying reptiles that appeared in the late Triassic period, around 230 million years ago. In the Triassic, insects were larger than they were in the Jurassic after pterosaurs had appeared. After the evolution of birds around 150 million years ago, insects got smaller despite rising oxygen levels. Stop and think about that. Even when atmospheric oxygen rose again, insects never went back to giant sizes. Why? Because birds had arrived. And somewhere in that transition existed the last generation of insects that never knew what it meant to be prey in the sky. Their descendants were born into a different world already, a world where size no longer kept you safe, it gave you away. Researchers at UC Santa Cruz concluded small insects always existed. Even back in the Permian, when these giant insects were flying around, countless species had wings just a few millimeters long. Body size has always been a combination of ecological and environmental factors, and there are countless ecological reasons insects stay small. Carboniferous insect gigantism wasn't down to one simple factor. It was a convergence of several circumstances at once. High oxygen that let the respiratory system support a large body. A dense atmosphere that made it easier for heavy wings to fly. And, most importantly, the absence of anyone who could eat them. When the first flying vertebrates appeared, pterosaurs first, then birds, the balance shifted forever. A large insect in the air was no longer safe. It became an easy target. Natural selection started working in the opposite direction. Smaller size meant better maneuverability, better odds of escape, better survival. And here lies the cruelest irony of this whole story. The very size that had been their crown for 90 million years became their death sentence in a single geological instant. Nature didn't punish them for being weak, it punished them for what had once been their greatest strength. The giants didn't simply go extinct from a changing climate. They were replaced by a smaller and smarter version of themselves. 300 million years ago, the sky filled with wings for the first time in its entire history. Not feathers, not leathery membranes. The thinnest, most transparent insect wings, which invented flight 90 million years before a single vertebrate would manage the same thing. The earth belonged to them. A dragonfly the size of a seagull, a millipede longer than a person, a scorpion the size of a cat, a world with no competitors, a world where today's smallest creatures were once the planet's biggest predators. And even though the giants disappeared, their descendants never went anywhere. Today, insects are the most diverse group of animals on Earth. Millions of species, more than every other animal combined. They didn't become less successful when they lost their giant size. Quite the opposite. They became the most successful form of life this planet has ever seen. They just learned how to stay unnoticed. Every time you see a dragonfly fly past you in the summer, remember this. Its ancestors once flew over forests as tall as skyscrapers. Back when millipedes longer than you crawled across the ground. Back when scorpions were the size of cats. The world changed. The giants disappeared. But the wings stayed. And they're still here. Just smaller. Just easy to miss. Just waiting for you to look up and notice.